Ladies and gentlemen, this is part 2 of the video. I'm going to try to make this as fast as I can. It's going to be shorter, more condensed, less breaks and less thematic talking, so I'm going to try to get this done as quickly as possible. We had left off talking about Andrew Jackson, a president who we've really never seen anything quite like him before, because he was born a commoner, an average person, a poor man, unlike the majority of presidents up to this point. In fact, all of them, all 6 previous presidents, who were born to a relative wealth and were, members of the founding father class. So Andrew Jackson, of course, was born in modern day North and South Carolina in the border region, in which by the time he was 13, he had already fought in the American Revolution. Because of this fact, we know that he was a pretty tough guy. In fact, he got his face slashed by a British officer on a naval ship when he refused to shine his shoes. We know this, and mostly because his soldiers adored Andrew Jackson because they thought of him as old hickory. He was like tough as old wood. He would bend but not break. So Andrew Jackson by 1824 had become a cult level hero due to his exploits at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. We know Andrew Jackson would grow up to be this mythical figure among the everyman, the commoners in the area. So because of this, we know that Andrew Jackson would eventually go on to run for president in 1824 as a member of the Democratic Republican Party. Now, of course, he'd be running up against a member of his fellow party, which would be John Quincy Adams. Now, he felt that Adams wasn't a serious candidate, mostly because he ran based on nepotism, not because he had the best ideas or the best ideas for what good policy would be, but mostly because his daddy's name was John Adams, a founding father and former president. He was running on nepotism. So in this particular case, we would see that in the election of 1824, it would come up as a statistical tie. Now, granted, John Quincy Adams did not win the popular vote. In fact, Jackson would win the popular vote. He regained the most number of total votes, but he did not win the Electoral College vote. It was a tie. And because of that, it went to the House of Representatives. And of course, we know that the House of Representatives will pick the president if there is a tie. Henry Clay and a series of other members of the House had negotiated the fact into trying to make some potential bargainings of political power and upgrades, and would give the presidency to John Quincy Adams. Jackson finds this to be a rigged system. He thinks it's atrocious and would call this the corrupt bargain. Now, because of this corrupt bargain, Jackson is not president, and he has to find a way by 1828, when he vowed to run again, to become president. Now, by 1828, he had convinced many state legislatures to change their voting laws on the books to create the ability for states to allow those who do not own property to vote, allowing for the common man to vote. This was a clever idea because, remember, he had already won the popular vote. This would push him over the edge. So by 1828, he had already established his own political party by separating from the Democratic Republicans and splitting the party in half, thus creating the modern-day Democratic Party in 1828. He would win this election in a landslide, and it wasn't even close, and he would ultimately create the Jacksonian version of democracy, a president unchecked. So there's a couple things we need to know about Jackson's presidency. We know that the inauguration was a wild party. It was a rager at the White House. Pretty much allowed anybody who could get there into the White House. It was so wild that they actually had to remove him for his own safety. Because of this craziness that was going on at the White House, Andrew Jackson would fundamentally become what we call a populist president. He did things that because he felt it was fundamentally the right thing to do, because that's what people wanted him to do. Now, Andrew Jackson, well, he was an interesting character. So let's start off with the spoil system. Andrew Jackson valued many different types of characteristics in people, but the one characteristic he valued most was loyalty. Not necessarily skill or ability or knowledge or know-how. He wanted his people to be loyal and do what he said, and that was the most important thing for him. So this was the situation where he would go and remove many federal officials out of their particular jobs, not because they couldn't do their job. In fact, many of them were pretty great at their jobs, but it was because they weren't loyal to him and he didn't trust them, so he got rid of them. This was called the spoil system. Come victory, come the spoils. And in this particular case, because he's president, he gets to bring all his friends with him, whether they were good enough or not. And now with the spoil system in place, the presidency would continue. So we get to the tariff of abominations. We're gonna go through this very quickly because it is in your notes and I don't want to have to spend too much time on it. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. The South depended on imported goods because they didn't manufacture things at home. Because they didn't manufacture things at home, they depended on other countries to go and create things for them. Now remember, the South was really good at producing raw materials. Because they produced those raw materials, they could export those to foreign countries, and those foreign countries, instead of giving them money for them, would trade manufactured goods in their place. Now, a tariff on manufactured goods would cause the South to actually have to pay extra money for things that the North already made on their own. So this tariff in 1828 didn't really bother the North. In fact, they were perfectly cool with it because it didn't really affect them. Kind of like if they increase lunch prices and you bring your lunch to school. It doesn't bother you because you still bring your own lunch, so your price didn't go up. But for the South, who did buy lunch from school, their prices go up staggeringly, and they would call this the tariff of abomination. So the people in the South really did not like this, and in fact, Jackson would go to Congress and say, look, they're not happy, bring that price down, get them to pay this tariff, and let's all move on. But his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, would side with the South and say, look, this is a ridiculous tariff. We got to get rid of this. So much so, they created the concept of nullification. Though the doctrine of nullification means we'll just reject federal law that we think is unconstitutional and not follow it. Now, because they don't follow this federal law, this would cause some complications. Now, the states are openly challenging the federal government. Now, because of this tariff continuing, the South would go on to threaten to secede, specifically South Carolina. They would threaten to leave the Union, and this would anger Andrew Jackson to the point where he was quoted as saying that I will hang the first person I see when I get down there, and would send his Navy off the coast just to scare the people of South Carolina into thinking, guess what, you'll either cut my taxes or I'll have my military get them for me. Now, ultimately, this would be calmed down with a resolution. Henry Clay, the compromiser, once again, comes up with a negotiation tactic to try to bring everybody to the table, and we would reduce the level of this tariff over the course of a decade, and everybody makes nice. But this would lead us to his next biggest piece of legislation, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now, the Indian Removal Act was, unfortunately, the precursor to what would lead to the Trail of Tears. Now, because of the Indian Removal Act, we know that there were 5 great civilized tribes. Remember them: Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee. These civilized tribes had assimilated into American culture. They had learned to become a part of what would be what we call American culture. Cool. Now, because of that American culture, Brody, Daddy's working. So because of that American culture adaptation, most of these tribes had learned to speak English, they had Christian names, they followed American law and had constitutions of their own. And because of that, they felt that they had done enough to earn their right in American society. In fact, many Cherokee members even owned slaves. So because of this, they felt they were fine. Unfortunately for the Cherokee, what they didn't realize is that white Americans had found gold in parts of Georgia, which meant it was time for the Native Americans to go. So the Indian Removal Act would be passed, and Jackson would give them 30 days, sorry, that's a little fast. He would give them 1 year paid to vacate the area and go to Indian Territory, which would be modern day Oklahoma. Unlike other tribes who tried to react violently to this, the Cherokee went through the legal system, and they would actually go and challenge it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? They won. They won their Supreme Court challenge. The problem is, Andrew Jackson disregarded the Supreme Court decision and just said, you know what? I don't care. We're just gonna do this anyway. So because of this particular situation, what we come to realize is that Andrew Jackson was a president unrestrained. His nickname was King Andrew by this point. He kind of did what he wanted. He kind of did as he pleased. And a lot of his opposition party were very mad with him because it was challenging the notion of checks and balances. The Supreme Court told him no, and he did it anyway. But the problem, like a bad child who doesn't have good discipline, if there's no consistent check on his behavior, he's gonna continue the bad behavior. So we need to understand that Andrew Jackson kind of changed the way presidencies would be run and would ultimately lead to this expansion, not just in presidential power, but ultimately the size of the United States. So westward expansion, we're gonna make this very quick. You guys have maps, notes, and everything on it. We would see that there would be 5 major territorial gains. Florida, 1819. Remember, this is that reversed armed robbery where Andrew Jackson, when he was a general, was sent down to Florida to protect that border between Georgia and Florida from Seminole tribesmen and Spanish soldiers. What did he do? He invaded Spain, forced Spain into the sale of Florida, and we got Florida for a cool $5 million. Nice. Then we have the Great British Secession, which is the Red River Valley Territory in 1818, so a year before Florida, gained a little bit of territory, filled out the Louisiana Purchase. Texas, we're gonna go through this as fast as we can. So when it comes to Texas, there's a couple things we need to know about Texas. Well, first off, Texas was originally a part of Mexico. American settlers were moving into the territory, led by Stephen Austin, to go and claim it for land to create cotton on. Cotton was the king industrial agricultural yield that they were putting out this time. So they wanted to grow as much cotton as they can, and they brought their slaves and everything with them into this Texas region. Now, Mexico demanded that they follow Mexican law and authority. These Texans did not want to play by the rules. They wanted to maintain their slaves, which was illegal in Mexico. They wanted to not have to speak Spanish, and also they didn't want to become Catholic. They didn't want to follow the laws that Mexico put in place for them, even though they were on Mexican grounds. So Texas would fight for its independence. Now, of course, we think of the Alamo and the Goliad. These were heavy losses for the Texans during this battle. In fact, the Battle of the Alamo, calling it a battle is not really even fair, being that it was a siege in which every man, woman, and child at the Alamo was slaughtered and killed. And the Texans would spur each other on by saying, remember the Alamo and remember the Goliad, as they fought for independence in 1839. The problem is, well, I don't think it's 1839, I think it's 1836. Someone in the comments below tell me exactly the date. I got that wrong, but I'm kind of moving fast here. So because of this, Texas becomes independent, and of course Mexico says, well, fine, we'll let you become independent. However, you cannot join the United States. And Texas is like, sure. And guess what they want to do? They want to join the United States as soon as possible. But the problem is, it's kind of like the worst timing possible, because we were under the Missouri Compromise, this concept that we could only allow states in, like if we allow a free state, we got to allow a slave state and vice versa, and they would have to fall under a certain boundary beneath the southern border of Missouri. Well, we needed a free state to come into the Union before anybody would allow Texas, especially a state that large, to come into the Union. And it would take until Oregon Country in 1848 to become a part of the United States. Now, of course, Texas would be allowed in 1845. It becomes a state before Oregon technically is finalized, but we knew that it was coming. So Texas becomes a part of the United States. It would be officially annexed into the United States. Annexation is literally just a territory absorbing another territory. So Texas would be annexed in 1845 and ultimately be the crown jewel of the slave states. It was a massive state that was great for agricultural yields, and it does very well. Now, Oregon was a fight between us and Britain. It was like the example we used in class. It was kind of like a kid leaving a space on a seat. And so we just wanted to make sure that, we wanted to claim that seat before Britain could claim that seat as well. We would argue and fight and say, well, it's the 54th or 40th parallel, or we're gonna go to war. Now, America realized we can't go to war with Mexico and Britain at the same time, so we didn't. And we ultimately would settle and claim the Oregon Territory at the 49th parallel. Both of these, under Texas and Oregon, were founded by James K. Polk. We need to know James K. Polk. He was the president that claimed more territory in his time as president than any other president in history. Now, because of our annexation of Texas, it led us to problems with Mexico. And we went to war in the Mexican-American War. Before this, we really wanted to claim about 3 territories: Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico. Now, we fight the war, and it doesn't last very long, about 2 years, and America wins. And with our win in the Mexican-American War, we gain a lot of territory. We get almost all of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. So we gain a ton of territory in this time. We only had to pay Mexico $15 million as compensation, and Mexico also had to pay some of our settlers $3.5 million for the continuous harassment there. But why did this whole war start? It was a border dispute. The Mexican-American War was fought because the Americans believed that the border with Mexico should be at the Rio Grande River, and the Mexicans believed it was at the Nueces River further to the north. So when the Mexicans sent soldiers there to protect their border, America felt that was an invasion, so promptly we declared war, and we ultimately won. So the Mexican section would come into the United States, thus giving us an additional 1/3 addition to the United States, making us a much larger territory. And that leads us to the last territory that would be entered into the United States, the Gadsden Purchase. And like I said before, there was only one main reason we bought the Gadsden purchase from Mexico. We needed trades to go be able to connect the East Coast to the West Coast because the Rocky Mountains, a little bit big in between to send trains through. So the Gadsden purchase right underneath the southern point of Arizona would allow us to go through and be able to send trains from one place over to the other. Guys, make sure you're going over your Quizlet and your Schoology and following everything that you need. Go ahead and watch this video. I talked really quickly this time, and so I would expect you guys to go on YouTube, slow this down, listen to it again. If I made any major mistakes or I didn't cut out parts where Brody walked in and started waving his toys in my face, I apologize in advance. I'm gonna have to rush edit this. So hopefully if you have any other questions, comments, concerns, please see me before the test. And there's my wife calling me. Have a wonderful day. I want to hang up. There we go. All right, bye.